Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about Mexican migrant workers in the early 20th century who would spark Mexico's 1910 revolution, one of the most critical global events of the century. These migrant workers, in fact, did it right here from the United States. The United States, not surprisingly, joined Mexican authorities at the time to try to quell it. It's also a story about an early FBI and what my guest argues, the first mass deportation of migrant workers to Mexico. It's a fascinating story, and I'm very happy to welcome to this radio program to talk about it, Kelly Lytle Hernández. Kelly Lytle Hernández holds the Thomas E. Lifka Endowed Chair in History, and she directs the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies at UCLA. She is the author of the book, Bad Mexicans, Race, Empire, and Revolution in the Borderlands. It was awarded the 2023 Bancroft Prize in American History. Kelly Lytle Hernández, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thank you for having me on. It's my honor to be here with you.
Again, it's a fascinating story, and it's an important story, and a story you want to make sure it becomes a part of U.S. history, because it is also a part of U.S. history. Let's begin with context. Tell me about, before the revolution, the president Porfirio Diaz. He is someone who had served 7 terms as Mexico's president, which, today, if you're familiar with Mexican politics, president serves one 6-year term. He served 7 years, was in power for over 30 years, from about 1876 to 1911. What's important to know about these years?
So what's important to know about Porfirio Diaz is that he came to power already as a legendary military general. And he held power by pulling all politics into his seat and in his person. So you could not get appointed to any position across Mexico without the approval of Porfirio Diaz. You could not get elected to any position without the approval or the friendship of Porfirio Diaz. And in this way, he smashed democracy in Mexico. But he also helped to take a rural, indebted nation and haul it into the global economy by transforming Mexico into a workforce and into a set of mines that were producing natural resources for the global economy, silver, copper, and more. And so he does this by inviting in foreign investors who he basically gives away land, and he essentially gives away Mexican citizens as low-wage workers and ensures that they'll stay in their workplace with a very corrupt and violent police force known as Los Rurales. And so together, Porfirio Diaz smashes democracy, and he brings modern capitalism to Mexico that dispossesses millions of Mexican families, leaving about 98% of Mexican citizens landless. And in this way, he makes Mexico a plug in the modern economy. So he brings what he calls progress and order and progress.
That was his term, right? That was a slogan.
That was his slogan, right? So Mexico had, in the 19th century, really been struggling. They had been invaded multiple times by foreign powers, including the United States, right? In the U.S.-Mexico War of 1846 to 1848. Mexico had struggled with a series of epidemics that had really harmed the population and grinding poverty, as well as political instability. There were about 50 presidents in Mexico between 1830 and 1876. There was a constant set of coups and turnover. And so it's in this context that Porfirio Diaz comes to power, really slowly as a dictator who brings, quote, order and progress to Mexico.
Would he qualify as being fascist? I mean, this is before you get a fascist movement in Italy, but quite frequently you have this dictator rise out of political instability. I mean, it's sort of a historical norm that we have seen and cycle. And just reading about him, again, he has been called the great modernizer, would sort of bring in railroads and electrify Mexico. But again, if you disagreed with him, you would be quashed.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly was an authoritarian, right? And he preferred to rule by gift and by friendship. And if he could convince and cajole you into following his lead, that was his preferred method. But never forget that he absolutely would call out his police forces if you refused to comply. So he's a very interesting character. The violence would always come, but it would come fairly late in the process.
This would have devastating effects for the indigenous population in Mexico.
That's absolutely correct. So Porfirio Diaz had committed himself in many ways to a program that was similar to that of the United States government, that he was going to modernize Native peoples by killing the Indian to save the man, right? And so he was attempting to break apart communal landholding, whether it be by campesinos, peasants, or indigenous peoples, and to also smash independent indigenous nations and sell away parcels of their land to themselves, right, to become independent farmers, right, or independent producers, and also to these domestic and foreign elites who would gobble up millions, hundreds of thousands of hectares and turn them into mining operations, industrial agriculture, run railroads through the land so they could get all these products out. But he absolutely was committed to transforming Native life in Mexico by modernizing Native life in the sense of turning them into independent producers.
The United States plays an important role in this, and we're going to get into the story of the migrant workers who came from Mexico to the United States, and again would sort of spark one of the most important global events of the 20th century, the Mexican Revolution. But before we get there, the United States business interest and elites play an important role in the story you tell.
Yeah, let's talk about it. So almost as soon as Porfirio Diaz comes to power in 1876, he and his emissaries are coming to the United States to meet with some of the most significant, most powerful industrialists in the United States. And, former President U.S. Grant actually helps to facilitate many of these relationships. And so he invites people down, the Rockefellers, the Guggenheims, and many more, to come and invest in Mexico. And you have not just these major industrialists, but also Mexico is seen as being the, quote, treasure house of the world. So ordinary U.S. citizens who have maybe just a few dollars to their name are going down to Mexico trying to make their fortune, often in mining. And so you have a wide array of people, but it's tens of thousands of U.S. citizens who have some kind of financial investment in Porfirio Diaz's regime. The investment is that he welcomes them in and allows them to get access to land at a fraction of the cost or sometimes simply given away. And then he also protects them as they begin to push off Native communities or campesinos from traditional land holdings. And when there's protests, Porfirio Diaz would send in his police force, Los Rurales, and they would suppress any kind of dissent, largely through arrests or conscripting people into the army, or sending people to prison, or deporting them down to southern Mexico to work on henequen farms, really as through debt servitude. So it's in this way that he protects these foreign investors and their investments in Mexico, so they can lay the tracks for railroads, so they can build the mines, so they can grow industrial agriculture. And so they're very committed to making sure that he stays in power and his type of rule is the norm in Mexico.
Hearing this, I can't help but think of more modern day parallels as the enactment of NAFTA in 1994 and the immediate uprising of the Zapatistas. There were things going on before 94 that would bring Zapatistas, but that's when they sort of make their way on the national stage. That's what they were concerned about. I mean, they were thinking about this history, right?
Absolutely. And so I think you raise a good point that the Magonistas, that's the group that we're talking about here. They are popularly known as followers of a man named Ricardo Flores Magón, although they would say that they're independent thinkers, certainly. They become known as the Magonistas. They go on to have a deep legacy of organizing on both sides of the borders. And certainly the Chicano movement here in the United States took the Magonistas and their anti-capitalist and their anti-racist ideologies that waver somewhere between socialism and anarchism. They really take this as a model for organizing. The Magonistas are their grandmothers and their grandfathers. But that's certainly true of the Zapatistas as well. The Magonistas are legendary in Mexico. There are towns named after Ricardo Flores Magón. There are streets named after Magonistas. Just last year, 2022, the Mexican government declared to be the entire year to be the year of Ricardo Flores Magón for the entire state of Mexico. And so they have inspired many groups, including the Zapatistas.
Ricardo Flores Magón and his brother were a part of a larger group of people who were migrating then because of this dynamic of what we're talking about, what's happening during the Porfirio Diaz regime, the relationship to the United States, the investment in the land, the taking land away from people. Is this driving migration to the United States?
That's right. So in particular, the dispossession, the land dispossession that is happening during El Porfiriato, that's the era of Porfirio Diaz, it forces many people to look for wage work. At first, they look for that wage work within Mexico on all these new mines and farms and railroads that are being built. But soon, especially as those railroads, and you have to understand that the railroads being built in Mexico almost exclusively head in one direction, toward the United States. This is because U.S. investors came in, dominated the railroad industry, and wanted to build a transportation system that yanked out resources from Mexico and brought them up to the United States for processing, then for distribution around the world. So, of course, the Mexican workers who are laying the track that's going to extract all these resources, they are moving progressively toward the border. And once the railroad is finished, they're jumping on that train and they're heading north to the United States in search of work. And they're being recruited to the United States by labor recruiters to do so. And that's a key part of this story, is that Mexicans don't come up with this idea by themselves that we're going to migrate en masse to the United States for labor. There are recruiters, especially from the southwestern United States, which after the Newlands Reclamation Act is growing at a phenomenal pace. The agricultural industries across the western United States are growing at a phenomenal pace once they have water after the Newlands Act. And they need workers, right? And so the recruiters are going down to Mexico, making all kinds of promises to Mexican workers. If you come north, you're going to make 4 times as much as you make in Mexico. We're going to give you all kinds of bonuses to come north. And so this is how mass migration for ordinary Mexicans begin. And Ricardo Flores Magón and his friends are in Mexico City, and they launched this newspaper called Regeneration. And in that newspaper, they're beginning to criticize this new political and economic order of Porfirio Diaz. They say that he's a dictator. They say that he's a tyrant. They say that he's turned Mexicans into the, quote, servants of foreigners. And they're also beginning to criticize this economic order, wondering, has Diaz given away most of Mexico to foreign investors? And it's for this criticism on the pages of Regeneración that Porfirio Diaz, of course, first tries to cajole them into his regime. When that does not work, he has them arrested multiple times, has their printing presses smashed, even issues a gag order against them. No newspaper in Mexico can publish any of their writings by 1903. And so Ricardo Flores Magón, his brother Enrique Flores Magón, and a group of their fellow writers, including women like Juana Belén Gutiérrez de Mendoza, they decide to flee Mexico very quietly and go to the United States, where they can rebuild their newspaper, distribute it back to Mexico, and try to continue to agitate against Porfirio Diaz. So that's how Ricardo Flores Magón comes to the United States as a migrant. He really is in exile, right? He's an intellectual in exile, a political agitator in exile.
Important to note that the Magón brothers' father was actually a supporter of Porfirio Diaz at one point, and even helped fight in order to allow Porfirio Diaz to stay in power for as long as he did.
That's right. So the family story is that the father of Ricardo and Enrique Flores Magón, as well as the mother, both helped to fight in a key battle that helped put Porfirio Diaz in power. And the family lore is that when the family moved to Mexico City and fell upon hard times, they reached out to this new president, Porfirio Diaz, for help. And Porfirio Diaz did not help. And that really does not sit well with the children who grow up in grinding poverty. And they have a political dispute with Porfirio Diaz, but they also come to have this very deeply personal dispute, a grudge, right? That this powerful president refused to aid their father, their family, in a time of need. And so you can see that play out over time, that this is a revolution that's led by two individuals who have a true politics, a political opposition to Porfirio Diaz, but also a personal grudge.
Tell me about their politics.
So their politics are very interesting. They certainly begin as liberals, right? In the sense that they wanted to see the Mexican Constitution lived in full, which meant there would be no re-elections, no president could serve more than one term, which meant that there would be more respect for land rights and restrictions on foreign ownership of land, especially close to the border. All of these things Porfirio Diaz had violated. Over time, especially as they experience the suppression of the Diaz regime, Ricardo Flores Magón in particular becomes more and more radical. He is reading the works of Marx and Kropotkin and others, and he is deciding that he is an anarchist. We're not quite sure when he becomes an anarchist, but it certainly, he declares that position by 1911. And this becomes a source of tension among him and his dissident friends. Those who remain socialists decide that they want to return to Mexico and fight in the revolution, while the anarchist band, Ricardo Flores Magón, Librado Rivera, and others remain in the United States to issue more radical claims in their ongoing newspaper against not just the Diaz regime, which by 1911 had fallen, but also against the United States and global elites writ large.
The term tierra and libertad, land and freedom, we associate this with the Mexican Revolution. I think we associate it with Emiliano Zapata, but it actually comes from Ricardo Flores Magón, and this kind of is an anarchist slogan, isn't it?
That's right. So Tierra y Libertad, land and liberty, is an anarchist slogan that Ricardo Flores Magón emblazons on the front page of Regeneración as we near the outbreak of the 1910 Mexican Revolution. And the story goes, well, we know that Emiliano Zapata was reading this newspaper as early as 1906, but the story goes that he also picks up this slogan from Regeneración and then really makes it the battle cry of the Zapatistas. And so many people who are very familiar with Emiliano Zapata and this slogan are not familiar with where he got the story from. Yeah, and this is the importance of the Magonistas, is that they really are intellectual leaders in the fulfillment and the formation of the Mexican Revolution. And this is just one example of how they helped to shape the ideas at the heart of the story. Now you think about the Mexican Revolution, and another person who is known as one of the major leaders, a man named Francisco Madero, who becomes the first president of Mexico after Diaz is deposed. He's a much more moderate individual, right? He wanted to see democracy restored, but he didn't really want to see major economic transformation in Mexico. And you juxtapose him to the ideas and the thoughts of the Magonistas, who demanded not just democracy, but the end of debt servitude, the end of child labor, the redistribution of land, and much more. Many of those ideas go on to be enshrined in the 1917 Mexican Revolution, which is the creation of this revolution. We can debate whether or not those ideas ever are enforced, but they are enshrined in the Mexican Revolution. That did not come from Francisco Madero. That comes from a deeper well of ideas that led to the revolution. That well includes the Magonistas, the Zapatistas, and many others.
Tell me more about who the Magonistas were, and did they have a receptive community in the United States from the folks who were leaving Mexico because of sort of the context that we talked about of what was happening in the country?
Okay, so let's talk about these people. So Ricardo Flores Magón actually had been a law student. He dropped out of law school. He became a bit of a wanderer, right? He was drinking too much. He was hanging out in brothels. He was having some wild 20s. His brother called it his stormy period, right? And he has a transformation in his mid-20s, and he decides he wants to join his older brother, Jesus Flores Magón, in political dissent and also in writing, in journalism in particular. And his older brother, Jesus, who's a lawyer and kind of sober and level-headed, but also an agitator, welcomes his brother in, and they begin this enterprise together. They later invite their younger brother, Enrique Flores Magón, who's known as sort of the clown, the jokester of the family, but who is, to the end of his days, committed and loyal to Ricardo Flores Magón. These three brothers come together as the nucleus of this group of agitators. They're joined by people like Librado Rivera, who was a school teacher from San Luis Potosí. He was very quiet. His friends nicknamed him El Fakir for his sort of ascetic ways. They're joined by an incredible woman, Juana Belén Gutierrez de Mendoza, who began her career as an agitator as in the mines and demanding labor rights for her husband and the men that he worked with. She ended up being arrested so many times, and she was such an incredible woman that rather than writing her name on her jail forms where it asked for her name, she would simply write sedition and rebellion.
Wow.
This woman went on to launch her own newspaper. It was an anarchist feminist newspaper called Vesper. She too would come north and help relaunch Vesper and Regeneración. And she would break away from Ricardo Flores Magón. They ended up having some some personal battles and beefs. And she would go ahead and do many things. One of those things was join the Zapatistas, become a colonel in Emiliano Zapata's army, and help to ghostwrite his Plan de Ayala, which is his manifesto for revolution. So she's extraordinary. And there are other people that come north with them. Ricardo Flores Magón certainly is not alone. He's part of a community of agitators who migrate north in hopes of continuing their assault on the Diaz regime from north of the U.S.-Mexico border.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Kelly Lytle Hernández. She's the author of the book Bad Mexicans, Race, Empire, and Revolution in the Borderlands. It was awarded the 2023 Bancroft Prize in American History. Bad Mexicans, the title, this actually comes from Porfirio Diaz. This is what he called the Magonistas, malos mexicanos.
That's correct. It comes from two places. So Porfirio Diaz and his regime certainly disparaged these political agitators as malos mexicanos, or bad Mexicans. They say it repeatedly throughout their letters and memos in their efforts to try to suppress this movement. It also comes from the U.S. side of the border. And there is an incident, on the U.S. side of the border, Mexicans are seen as good Mexicans when they are docile, quiet, transient workers. That is a good Mexican in the early 20th century mainstream parlance of the United States. And a bad Mexican is the one who protests and agitates and demands better working conditions and higher wages. And this comes to a head in the United States late in the Magonistas movement, even after certainly after its heyday, when there is a movement in southern Texas to reclaim land for not just Mexicans and Mexican Americans, but also for African Americans and for indigenous peoples. A group of Mexican rebels under the banner of Tierra y Libertad wanted to reclaim land for African Americans to provide us a sanctuary from white supremacy, and to provide land for indigenous peoples as a sanctuary from settler colonialism. And we were to receive the first sets of lands from this rebellion. And next, Mexicans and Mexican Americans would be provided lands for their own sanctuary.
Did that have a name?
Yes, it's called El Plan de San Diego. And when El Plan de San Diego began, Mexican rebels declared that they were going to form an army for the liberation of all races and peoples. and that they were going to kill every white man over the age of 16 and then claim these lands to provide sanctuary for Black, Indigenous, and Mexican and Asian peoples. As soon as that began on July 4th of 1915, they murdered several white men, and the U.S. Army was sent in. Thousands of white men were deputized, and they really created a list of so-called malos mexicanos, or bad Mexicans, that they were going to go out and assassinate. And it took years. Scholars still don't know, but anywhere between 300 and 3,000 Mexicans were murdered in retaliation for El Plan de San Diego in the mid 1910s. And so this is a scarring moment in the history of the United States that helps to define Mexicans as not just another immigrant group that will be assimilated and incorporated into the United States, but as a racialized community that will be the subject of racial terror in the United States.
You begin your book telling a story about a lynching in Los Angeles. What's significant about that? Is that's 1911?
I begin the book with the lynching of Antonio Rodriguez, which is in Rock Springs, Texas, in 1910. And it's a story that unfortunately is not very well known, but it has been told, certainly in the academy, and I would encourage people to look at the work of Refusing to Forget. It's a website that documents the lynching of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the United States. And Texas was certainly the central point of all of that. And so I opened the book with the lynching of Antonio Rodriguez. He had been accused of killing a white woman. He was also accused of being a Magonista, and he was killed in early November of 1910. And it's a murder that Mexican American journalists, including the Magonistas, cover in their newspapers. Mexican newspapers pick up the story, and as soon as they do, all kinds of riots and protests break out across Mexico City and other cities in Mexico, in which protesters burn American flags, decry death to the Americans, that Americans, namely they mean here Anglo-Americans, have come in and bought up all the land and subjected laborers to poor working conditions. And they said, we've had enough. And so these riots become part of the early seeding of the Mexican Revolution, which begins in late November of 1910.
You will forgive me for mixing up some of those details. Sometimes I just mix things up. But this is significant, though. Tell me more about the spark that the Magonistas bring to sparking the Mexican Revolution.
Sure. So the Magonistas do three things. Once they get to the United States, they're able to relaunch this rebel newspaper, Regeneración, first from San Antonio, Texas, and then from St. Louis, Missouri. And then after Ricardo Flores Magón and several others are arrested and they jump bail and they begin to live on the run, they're still able to keep Regeneración going. What's important about Regeneración is they're able to smuggle it into Mexico. Migrant workers carry it with them, sort of stuffed under their shirts or in their hats, because just the whisper of Magón in Mexico is enough to get you arrested or killed by the police. And the significance here is that the ideas that are on that page, which only few people could read, but the stories would be told by mouth, like at bars and at schools and in the fields, that what people were experiencing in Mexico was not an individual issue. And here I want to bring up the issue of sexual violence. The way in which Porfirio Diaz largely appointed people across the country and then allowed them to rule with impunity. As long as they did his bidding, he allowed them to rule with impunity within their own locale, subjected women and girls across Mexico to the sexual violence of local male representatives. And many communities might feel, many families might feel that this is something that was just a bad apple in their community, that is just happening to them. But Regeneración was printing the stories of rape and assault across the country. And in learning that, no, this is happening here, it's happening here, it's happening there, it's happening here, across the country, people are now beginning to make a systemic analysis of what is happening to them, a structural analysis, and that they want change to happen for their family. They're going to have to go to the root of the problem. And the root of the problem is not only their local representative, but it goes all the way up to the dictator who appointed and protects those people across the country. So regeneración is really significant for helping people to come to that structural analysis that demands more than simply replacing an individual at the local level or small reforms, but it's something much deeper is needed, namely the removal of Porfirio Diaz from power. And since Porfirio Diaz, who held 7 consecutive terms, more or less, as you noted, he's not going to let go of the reins of power. And so that means revolution is the answer. So that's why regeneración is important. But the Magonistas are also able to establish a political party, El Partido Liberal Mexicano, the PLM, to help mobilize those ideas into political action. And they're able to establish an army, the PLM army. And this army is extraordinary. It's made out of migrant workers, out of cotton pickers, out of intellectuals on both sides of the border, but they largely marshal on the United States of the border. And they raid Mexico 4 times between 1906 and 1908, largely from Texas. Those raids on Mexico destabilize the Diaz regime in the sense that it makes people wonder around the world. I mean, newspapers in Germany, newspapers in Europe, newspapers in the United States are covering the story of these raids on northern Mexico. It makes people wonder if Porfirio Diaz's rule really is as strong as he makes it out to be. And so these are the reasons why the Magonistas are important. These are the 3 things that they're really able to do north of the border is reestablish regeneración, build a political party, and even put together an army that raids Diaz's Mexico.
The United States, I think this is during the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, would sort of work with Porfirio Diaz in trying to squash this movement in the United States. Tell me about that. And this would also tie into a very early FBI.
Yeah, so this is a big part of the story, right? So very early on when the Magonistas arrive in the United States, the Diaz regime reaches out to the Roosevelt administration and says, hey, we need your help. Our public enemies, number one, have escaped to the United States and they're starting to agitate. They're going to relaunch their newspaper and we need you to quiet all this down. In the beginning, the United States is like, we're not worried about a couple of Mexicans in the border area, not relevant to us. But as soon as the Magonistas launched their first raid in September of 1906, that's when the United States government gets serious and involved. They say, oh, these people are serious. They're beginning to raid Diaz's Mexico, and Diaz is the person who protects all of our U.S. investors down there. So now we have our interest in working very tightly with the Diaz regime. So Porfirio Diaz hires a series of spies, turns his consular offices into spy rings as well. And they begin to monitor the Magonistas. Diaz hires a spy named Thomas Furlong in particular, who's able to infiltrate or work very closely with the United States Postal Service. And what they're able to do is get spies to pull the rebels' mail out of post boxes, open up the rebels' mail, copy down their letters, put the letter back in and send it on its way, hoping that the Magonistas wouldn't know that surveillance was following them everywhere, tracking down their whereabouts, following their plans for the next raid. Magonistas did figure out that their mail was showing up violada or violated, and so they began to write in secret code, and they began to write in cipher, and they began to send their letters through at least 5 or 6 intermediaries. They began using pseudonyms. And so the archive that we have to tell the Magonista story is largely from these stolen letters that are written in secret code and with pseudonyms. But once you crack all those secret codes, you're taken right to the front lines of this extraordinary revolution. So they're on the move while these spies are following them everywhere. And they're trying to stitch their revolution back together. However, Thomas Furlong and many others are able to use these letters to track down Ricardo Flores Magón and others. And Ricardo is arrested in a shack outside of Los Angeles on Pico Boulevard in 1907. Thomas Furlong, one of his agents, and 2 LAPD officers kicked down the door of this shack about 4 p.m. in August of 1907. and they brawl with Ricardo Librado Rivera and another man named Antonio Villarreal for like an hour.
It's a brawl. It's just not an arrest. It's a brawl.
They're smashing furniture and plates, and they're screaming and they're yelling. But eventually, the detectives are able to haul the rebels out into the street. Ricardo's been knocked unconscious. Librado and Antonio are trying to yell out their names to these passersby who are beginning to crowd around all of the ruckus. And Mexicans in the crowd recognize the name of Ricardo Flores Magón. I mean, he's already legendary by this point. And they realize, oh my gosh, Ricardo Flores Magón has been living in hiding right here in Los Angeles. And they begin to chant, like, set them free, set them free, set them free. The detectives refused to set them free. They likely were trying to kidnap them back into Mexico before anyone could notice. But all the ruckus meant that they had to actually pull Ricardo, Librado, and Antonio to the local jail. And they throw them into solitary confinement there. And here's the most fabulous thing. U.S. and Mexican authorities thought that once they arrested Ricardo Flores Magón, the so-called leader of this revolution, right? They have this one-man theory of revolution. That's never how it works. They thought that with Ricardo in jail, the revolution would die, right? Ricardo was already sick. He might die too. But women in particular held this revolution together. They smuggled correspondence back and forth to Ricardo Flores Magón in jail. And they helped to pass new battle plans to other rebel leaders. And it's in this way that the Magonistas are able to launch a series of raids in late 1908, June of 1908. Now, these raids are important because they're lethal. Dozens of people die in these raids with the Magonistas in 1908. And they also amplify the attention of the United States. And so as soon as these raids happen, on July 1st of 1908, the United States government establishes a new police force within under the U.S. Attorney General, the Department of Justice. This police force is called the Bureau of Investigation. Teddy Roosevelt had wanted this Bureau of Investigation to largely go out and investigate land fraud in the American West. But once they're established on July 1st, just days after the Magonistas' most lethal raids, they divert the attention to this new Bureau of Investigation. They say, actually, one of your very first charges is to go out and round up all these revolutionaries and suppress a revolution in Mexico before it can begin. And so this Bureau of Investigation, which goes on to become the FBI, the counterinsurgency superforce of the United States, really cuts its teeth in this effort to round up Magonistas and thwart the outbreak of the 1910 revolution, which we all know they absolutely failed to do.
You also write this would bring us the first mass deportation of people to Mexico.
That's right. So in this counterinsurgency campaign, the United States leverages a new power. That power is called deportation. Deportation was a really new tool of governance that was created in the late 19th century, largely targeting Chinese immigrants. In 1906, 1907, at this point, Mexicans were not on the radar for immigration control at all. In fact, it was quite the opposite. If Mexicans showed up at the border, U.S. border guards would hardly look in their direction, barely nod. They wanted to make sure the workers were arriving north of the border. And so after the first Magonistas raid in September of 1906, a group of Magonistas are rounded up in Arizona by the U.S. Immigration Service. And the leader of the Immigration Service there is aware of U.S. investments in Mexico. He's like, yo, I know this really isn't my job, but we have to protect U.S. investors in Mexico. And so we got to get these revolutionaries out of here. They're causing all kinds of trouble. Get them back down to Mexico where Diaz can deal with them. And so his name is George Webb, subjects a group of Magonistas in southern Arizona to deportation. And this is the first real mass deportation of Mexicans in U.S. history. And it absolutely is politically driven.
It's just so interesting to think about. I think you also said earlier, because of what you have happening in Mexico, because of the taking of the land and dispossession of people from their land, you get the first people historically have always migrated, but you get the first, something we'd recognize as the first major migration into the United States from Mexico. This is also the time you get the first deportation, great major deportation going on. I mean, a cycle that has not stopped since.
That's right. Well, the Diaz regime really is the origin story of what people today might call U.S.-Mexico integration. Some other people might call it U.S. imperialism. So the Magonistas are operating at the heart of all of this. They're operating at the heart of U.S. empire, right? Because they're not just protesting Diaz, they're protesting the people who make Diaz's power possible, which is European investors, yes, but definitely United States investors. They are having to thrash against the terror of white supremacy in the United States, which is why I opened this book with a lynching, which is a racial lynching, because to organize, not just amongst themselves as writers and intellectuals, but they are organizing Mexican migrant workers in the United States who are here, according to U.S. employers, to pick cotton. But according to themselves and their own dreams, their own demands for their lives, they are here to transform the conditions of their lives. In part, that means, yes, right now getting wages, but it also means looking back to Mexico and getting rid of Porfirio Diaz so they can return and rebuild their lives. And they're also having to do this against really the origins of federal policing and the FBI. And so they're an extraordinary group of just regular, troubled and brilliant and amazing ordinary people who are having to build a revolution at the heart of all of this.
Ricardo Flores Magón would die in prison. Tell me about that.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, so Ricardo Flores Magón, once the Mexican Revolution begins, he's invited to go back to Mexico to help rebuild a post-Diaz administration. He refuses to do so. By then, by 1911, he's an anarchist, so he does not believe in government, so he's not going to join a government, right, and help to build one. He decides to stay in the United States, in Los Angeles in particular. He and his brother Enrique and several others begin to live on a commune in Edendale, more or less East LA, and they are able to crank out every now and then new issues of Regeneración. And in 1916, 1917, they crank out an issue that has to do with encouraging people to not register to fight or to fight the draft for World War I. And that is what brings the United States government literally crashing into the commune to arrest Ricardo Flores Magón and others. And he ends up doing time in federal prison. He's eventually sent to Leavenworth, where he dies in November of 1922.
Yeah, Leavenworth is interesting. Most of us know about it because that's where Chelsea Manning was held for a number of years.
That's right. So, but also at this time period, you've got all kinds of radicals and rebels who are being held in Leavenworth. You've got Eugene Debs, right? You've got a lot of Wobblies. You've got these Magonistas. I mean, I think there are many wonderful books that need to be written about the revolutionary potential of people who are incarcerated. And this is one of those stories. There's another historian who's written about the Magonistas and has a new book out, Christina Heatherton, and the book is called Arise, which does address this in some part.
That's interesting. Can you tell me a little more about the code and the code that was, I mean, you really dived into this, didn't you? In looking at the code, I mean, you could read the code.
Yes, the secret codes that the
Magonistas, that they were writing between each other.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating because once they figured out that they were being surveilled, they began to translate all of their letters into secret code. And sometimes they'd use several codes at a time. And so it was very difficult for them. Actually, I'll show you a little secret. My son and I have their secret code, Tierra y Libertad, in secret code. And we have shared tattoos on our arms.
That's wonderful. Well, what a great tattoo.
I think it's original. I hope so. Something special just for the two of us.
And was it an alphabetic code or were there just symbols?
They're just symbols. Yeah. And so if you look in the book, I provide you one of the letters written in secret code and then the code key that the Diaz regime was able to put together to break that code. And then you can read the letter once you break the code yourself. And so it slowed down their communication because they're constantly translating their letters in and out of secret code to make sure that they don't fall into the government's hands, and therefore the government will be able to figure out where they're heading next. To some degree, I would say that the U.S. and Mexican governments had a much more successful run at suppressing the revolution when Ricardo Flores Magón and the others were out of jail and prison and living on the run and having to write in secret code. It just wore them down, right? It forced Ricardo Flores Magón into isolation. He stopped writing because he was lonely, he was hungry. It was once they arrested him and several other leaders, many other leaders, and they're in jail or prison, that they're actually able to rebuild their movement in some ways. That their leaders are stationary, and they figured out how to smuggle correspondence back and forth to them. And they're also able to commune with people in visiting rooms. They're able to whisper to them from outside their cells. I mean, jails are in the middle of towns. The windows are open. These are kind of open flowing spaces in the early 20th century. And it's from jail that they're able to really rebuild their movement and no longer have to write in secret code. They're already in jail.
They leave behind a key?
They have multiple keys, right? So this is the point. They didn't create just one code and one cipher. They were creating new codes every week, right? To stay ahead of the government. So they have all kinds of codes. You can go to a website, elarchivomagon.net, what has been created by several scholars in Mexico, to look at many of Ricardo Flores Magón's original letters.
Kelly Lytle Hernández has been our guest. She has joined us to talk about her book. It's called Bad Mexicans, Race, Empire, and Revolution in the Borderlands. It was awarded the 2023 Bancroft Prize in American History. Kelly Lytle Hernández, that was fascinating. Thank you for joining us to tell us the story.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.